Welcome to the Alex Salmond Show, where with Brexit done, but COVID resurgent, we look at the turbulent political year ahead. The year began in crisis. Will it end in normality? And how will the political parties fare in this new normal? From the right, we ask top Tory commentator Peter Oborne, will Boris Johnson be condemned for bungling the pandemic, or will he be lauded for bringing the country through to vaccination? And from the left, Professor Richard Murphy, we ask him whether Sir Keir Starmer's new Labour Party has the grit to cut through in these tough economic times ahead. All that coming up in the show. But now to Tasmina with your tweets, your emails and your messages.
Well, we've had a tremendous response to our show last week, featuring Cambridge virologist Dr Chris Smith and public health expert Dr Pankania. Steve Aldridge says, just watch Dr Chris Smith on the Alex Salmond Show. Best bit of information about COVID that I've had since the pandemic started. Follow the experts. Good advice, Steve. Bob Howie says, I've been saying it since August. Masks should be compulsory. There are much fewer disabled and people with underlying illnesses venturing out, so there are few people with a genuine reason not to wear a mask. Lorna Sharp says, so many amateur epidemiologists and virologists spreading misinformation, hopefully unintentionally. I prefer to listen to the experts, and once more, I thank them for their clear summations and advice. Also, I thank Alex and Tasmina for bringing us this weekly show. It's much appreciated. Well, thank you, Lorna. Gordon McKenzie says, great show with two guests that everybody should pay attention to. Too many people simply don't understand the facts relating to this pandemic. Kizzy says, great show, Alex and Tasmina. Questions we're all asking. Thanks for some answers, and maybe the two halves of the UK, Scotland and England will answer why we're behind other countries. And finally, Andrea with some good news, who's had her vaccination, says, I literally walked 10 minutes to my local hospital for mine today. It seems like a lifetime ago, but it's been a mere 13 months since Boris Johnson took the Tories to a landslide general election victory in the Christmas of 2019. Now, he has indeed struggled with the pandemic and the economy has collapsed, but Boris has got Brexit done and the vaccination programme is well underway. But can Tory supremacy survive the new order in which we're living? Alex turns to top Tory commentator Peter Oborne to find out.
Peter Oborne, by most accounts, Boris Johnson has been seen to have bungled the pandemic. Fishermen round the country can't get their fish to the European marketplaces, so the Brexit deal doesn't look particularly good. But still, the level pegging with the Labour Party in the opinion polls. Is it a case of if the vaccination programme goes OK, then everybody's going to forget about everything else?
You're making a very good point there, that despite endless mistakes, the Johnson government remains remarkably popular in the polls. On the other hand, I think there is a very difficult year ahead. As far as Brexit and the pandemic are concerned, we are living in a sort of phony war economically. There's going to be a moment when we enter a real economic situation. We'll know the level of unemployment, the amount of devastation which has been done to the economy. And I think then is the moment to judge this government.
So are you saying when we all emerge blinking into the sunlight, when we've had a vaccination, perhaps this summer, then people are going to turn their minds to what's happened in the past and whether the government should have been doing a lot better?
That's exactly right. There are all kinds of questions about the government performance, and the vaccination is definitely going to make this government look better, particularly when compared to the European Union, which seems to be making a right old mess of vaccinations, lagging way behind where Britain is. And of course, the government spokespeople will make the most of that. But nevertheless, there has got to be an accounting for the way the government has conducted itself. And more importantly still, we just simply don't know the depth of the damage done to the economy.
And are you saying that the Boris Johnson's fate is largely in the hands of his Chancellor of the Exchequer, who is the favourite to succeed him as Prime Minister. Isn't that a rather dangerous position to be in?
I think that Mr. Sunak has a lot of questions to answer. You know, the Eating Out campaign in last August, which was wildly praised in the press, turned out we can see that to have been a great mistake. His initial reaction to the pandemic was utterly feeble. He failed to grasp its magnitude. There are a number of errors which he's made, which he too will become accountable for. And bear in mind, number 10 won't be slow in pointing them out.
Is there some rethinking going on in the Conservative Party, traditionally the party of austerity economics, that perhaps their belief in fiscal balances shouldn't be as rigid as they thought hitherto?
Well, you're an economist, Alex, and what has happened in the last 12 months is completely unprecedented fiscally at any moment since World War II, when, in order to fight a world war, just all the floodgates were loosed. And so national debt is soaring upwards. This isn't just a case of Britain, by the way, it's throughout the world. And I think there is going to be an enormous fiscal reckoning. Once again, as an economist, you will understand that all national debts around the world were already at historically high levels, even before the pandemic. So we're now going to ask the question, how do we deal with exploding balance sheets? I'm noticing that the bond yields are starting to tick up. If they start to tick up a bit more, we're entering a very dangerous situation.
What's your estimation of the European issue now? I mean, this ghost that's haunted the Conservative Party for the last half-century, has it finally been laid to rest?
I'm not sure that the European issue has gone away, because the deal, which was praised much in the press, actually is starting to fall apart. There are whole kinds of issues involving business and the fishermen, of course, but all kinds of issues which will need to be revisited. And every time these issues are revisited, that will open up the fissures inside the Conservative Party between those who want to have nothing to do with Europe and those who want to strike a pragmatic deal. And so, no, it hasn't gone away.
Now, Peter Oborne, you're a long-term watcher of the Conservative Party, probably know more about its inner workings than any other journalist. What issues do you expect to emerge within the party? Are there ideological issues which are going to emerge, or is the party at peace with itself?
I have written about the Conservative Party for 3 decades. And it's important to understand that this party we have now is almost unrecognisable from the party which existed until only 5 years ago. It's instead of the pragmatic party of Lord Salisbury to John Major, it's turned into a sect, much more in common actually with Orban's Fidesz in Hungary. It's an alt-right party in many ways. Same nightmare situation, of course, struck the Republicans in the United States under Trump. And so it's almost not conservative, but it's almost a revolutionary movement captured by the Vote Leave people. Now, is that sustainable given that they've driven out, Boris Johnson quite deliberately and consciously drove out the old-fashioned traditional Tories like Rory Stewart, like Dominic Grieve, like Ken Clarke, all of these people, the middle ground Tories, have gone. And so that's left a whole sort of millions of voters without representation. And the big question is, what happens to them?
And thinking about the events across the Atlantic, does the demise of Donald Trump, does that present issues for the Prime Minister, that the new Biden administration might have memories that Boris Johnson was less than complimentary and helpful to President Obama? Is that going to be a big issue for Boris Johnson?
There are a number of leaders around the world who got very close to Trump, probably too close for comfort. One of them is the Saudi leadership. One of them is Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel. Another would be General Field Marshal Sisi in Egypt, and another would be Boris Johnson in Britain. And Boris Johnson has now got to choreograph himself vis-à-vis the United States. And it's quite obvious that the Biden administration doesn't like Brexit and is very sceptical about Johnson. Whether he can get back on track there, I don't know. I think it's a difficult one for the British Prime Minister. It may actually, it's important to notice and remember that changes in American politics are followed by changes historically in British politics. You know, and I wonder whether the departure of Trump from the stage actually presents a medium-term threat to Boris Johnson.
But might that be why the Johnson administration seems to have discovered the virtues of wind power and renewable energy? Do you think that's anticipating that climate change and the threat to the planet might be more compatible with the politics of the new American president?
I don't think it's fair to say that the rhetoric about wind power is the result of President Biden, because they've been talking that language for some time, not necessarily because they believe it, but because Britain is hosting this great environmental summit. And I think that this is a message which they want to get out there. And they are conscious and have been that this is a way of softening their rather hard right image in other areas.
Now, if you were to look at the coming year, after the extraordinary year of nightmare that every single one of us on the planet has experienced, but if you were to look at the political canvas for the coming year, from the Conservative perspective, where would you see the pitfalls ahead? And can you identify an issue perhaps not on anyone's radar that by this time next year we'll think was really important?
The one issue which I think is most uncertain in the coming year is the scale of debt, of not just Britain's debt, international debt. This has the capacity, the collapse of national balance sheets, to drive up bond yields, to drive up inflation, and really send the world into a major depression. If that happens, it is a very fearsome thing, and then you would see all kinds of effects, not just in Britain, but involving the rise probably of far left, far right political movements across Europe and America.
Now, finally, Peter Oborne, someone once said that the Conservative Party should be the party of sound money and short sentences. If Boris Johnson can manage the sound money, do you think he'll manage the short sentences?
I remember listening to Willie Whitelaw on the radio about 35 years ago when he was deputy leader of the Conservative Party, being interviewed on Scottish radio. And he was asked what economic policies the Conservatives had. He said, very sound economic policies. And that seemed to answer the question. We haven't got sound economic policies now. We are entering an unknown period. It is impossible to predict, and it's quite frightening. It doesn't just apply to Britain, it applies everywhere almost.
Peter Oborne, thank you very much for joining us once again on the Alex Salmond Show.
It's a huge pleasure, Alex. Thank you for having me on.
Join us after the break, where we look at the prospects for Sir Keir Starmer's Labour Party with Professor Richard Murphy. We'll see you then. Welcome back. What will this year hold for Sir Keir Starmer's Labour Party? And will a leadership change in Scotland allow Scottish Labour to make a dent in the stranglehold of the SNP? We turn to Professor Richard Murphy to discuss.
Professor Richard Murphy, from the Labour Party perspective, how will they be feeling about the political balance at the outset of the year? I mean, Johnson has bungled the pandemic. Brexit is done, but it's coming apart with fishermen can't getting fish to market. And yet they're pretty level pegging in the opinion polls. Will that be an encouragement or a disappointment to Labour?
I think Keir Starmer has achieved a goal. He has become imaginable as a prime minister, for some people at least. And if that was what he was trying to achieve, that people could, and the phrase is, close your eyes and imagine him on the doors of number 10, could you do that? Then the answer is yes, some people can. On the other hand, what he has not done, and this is very clear, is he has not delivered any sound reasons why anybody should vote for him. And I think there's a massive amount of disquiet inside Labour about that. So at the beginning of this year, Labour is not a happy party.
But many people are surprised that he's departed the new leader, Sir Keir Starmer, from the Corbyn era with such comparative ease, even expelling, suspending the old leader from the party. And yet there hasn't been any sign of widespread revolt. Is that just a symptom of the pandemic suffocating normal politics, or are people just come to accept that times have changed?
I think what we are actually seeing there, Alex, is a symbol of the current state of UK politics, which is intensely top-down. The leadership is in control of virtually every political party in the UK. And we're seeing that creating problems right across the spectrum. I think you know this. And my point is that he turns his back on the party once he's elected and is out there to deliver his message to the people beyond the party. He's now ignoring the base.
Now, it's the hope of the Labour Party leadership that once the emergency is subsiding, once people are vaccinated, then hard questions will start to be asked about the Johnson government's handling of the pandemic, the crisis in the care homes, the farce of Eat Out to Help Out, the Christmas relaxation, that people will start to ask very hard questions about how the pandemic was handled and why so many people are dead.
The truth is that once you actually look at the overall Labour position, it has been very much follow my leader, in the sense that they were saying they'd support the government in any initiative that was required. It's almost been national government territory in that sense. And that's pretty uncomfortable to defend, because they can't go back and say, for example, they had a distinctly different policy on many occasions. I don't believe that overall people are going to hold a significant number of people, enough to tip the balance of an election, are going to hold enough anger against the government to actually make COVID the critical issue if this government survives to 2024. What really matters now is what is Labour going to do about some of the other issues, for example, those that Marcus Rashford is putting forward, the way in which those who are hard up are being treated. What is the policy with regard to managing the post-coronavirus economy, where already we are seeing some very odd decisions apparently being trailed by the Treasury with regard to council tax increases and so on. What is Labour really going to say on those issues will, I think, become much more significant, I'm afraid, than the absolute mess up that the government has made on COVID, where far too many people are far too forgiving of the government's position.
So is there a case for saying that Marcus Rashford, the 22-year-old Manchester United and England footballer, has been the unofficial and successful leader of the opposition?
I'm not sure that Marcus Rashford has been the leader of the opposition. What is undoubtedly true is that he has caught the popular zeitgeist on some issues much more effectively than the Conservative Party did, and, to be candid, more effectively in terms of the opposition raise than the Labour Party did. He has realised that there is deeply implicit in this whole issue of COVID another second question, which is about the balance of economic well-being within the economy. So what we're seeing is the COVID crisis creating a two-part society. Some have done very well out of this crisis. Those who've stayed in work, who haven't had to travel to work, who've seen their costs fall as a consequence, have actually been able to either save or pay off debt. Those who have actually been in the most vulnerable jobs, who often were already on 0 hours and other contracts, are seeing a significant cost. And Labour is not shouting hard enough for the most vulnerable and leaving it to Marcus Rashford. And that's a negation of their traditional responsibility.
So as the population emerges vaccinated and blinking into the sunlight, but into hard economic times, is there a question as to whether Labour has the grit to cut through in that environment?
What we are seeing from Labour on the economy has been best summarised by Annalisa Dodds in the last week or so in a lecture that she gave in London. And the keynote aspect of that lecture was Labour is going to be prudent. It's as if we're going back to 1997 and hearing Gordon Brown back there again. Now, there's no evidence of any need for that. After all, the Conservatives have spent money as if it's going out of fashion over the last year, something like 400 billion, and they are going to run deficits over the next 3 or 4 years, up to an election of, in my estimate, of well over 150 billion pounds a year. And so the idea that somehow or other Labour has to prove that it isn't the money of big spending is absurd, because actually the Conservatives will be. What Labour has to prove is it's the money of sensible spending to rebalance the economy and address the really big social, economic, and of course, green issues that we face. But that was not really what was heard. So at the moment, I'm still worried that we're living, or Labour is living, in a past era where it believes it's got to reassure people about things that actually are not the areas where reassurance is any longer required. There is little sign of economic vision coming out of Labour in that sense at present.
But why is it that people should hang on to economic orthodoxy when we've just experienced the most dramatic demonstration of why economic orthodoxy can't meet a crisis of the scale of which we've been undergoing?
I am staggered that people still think that the old orthodoxies exist in economics. It is still as though people believe that the only way that government is funded is by taxation and borrowing, when we have convincingly proved since 2009 that there is a third element in this equation. And that third element is the government's ability to create money on its own account through the Bank of England. Over £800 billion has been created over the last decade to fund government deficits within the Bank of England without any requirement for repayment being made at all. This money will never be repaid. It's actually the cash that now underpins the economy we live in, and you literally could only repay it by tearing up money. We don't want to tear up money. We don't want to destroy that well-being. We don't want to remove the liquidity that is keeping our markets going. So we actually have a new economic power in the land, which at the moment, no economist of any, most economists certainly of any standing, and certainly the Conservatives and Labour don't want to recognise as being relevant. You don't have to be a modern monetary theorist, which is dismissed by many, to realise that this exists. You've just got to look at the fact that quantitative easing has created all this money, has put it into circulation, and has liberated governments to manage debt, and at the same time free themselves from the clutches of the money market and keep interest rates low, to realise that new economic policy is now entirely possible. What we've got to have are governments advised by economists who understand this, but as yet we're not getting that. And that really worries me, because we're sticking to the old austerity narratives when we don't need to.
Now, in terms of Scotland, the Labour leadership is changing. Richard Leonard's gone. Either Monica Lennon or Anas Sarwar is going to come in his stead. Will Sir Keir Starmer think that might solve his problems north of the border?
If Keir thinks that changing the leadership of the Labour Party in Scotland is going to change his fortunes in Scotland, then I'm afraid to say he's, in my opinion, grossly naive. You know, I follow the Scottish political scene quite closely. Labour was running fifth, and if it's lucky, it might just beat the Tories now, only because the Tories have been so diabolical. But the reality is, Labour is not even asking the questions that, as far as I can see, Scottish people want to address. When the leadership candidates are saying things like, well, inequality is the big issue we face in Scotland, and independence isn't, and the future of Holyrood and devolved powers is not the issue that we ought to have on the agenda, then frankly, they're just missing the point. The reality is that Labour has to either face up to the fact that a massive devolution programme, or frankly, independence is going to happen, or Scotland is of absolutely no relevance to them and nothing they say in Scotland will ever count again with any significant part of the population, or frankly, they just walk away. I mean, you know, Labour is just wasting its time if it doesn't listen to what people are saying in Scotland. And their assumption and I know so many people in Scotland think that this is true, that the Labour Party in Scotland is just a branch office of the Labour Party in London, when actually the Labour Party in Scotland has to say something very different indeed to be relevant in Scotland from what it has to say elsewhere, is just wrong. But we saw Keir Starmer obviously very angry that the Labour Party in Scotland on Brexit said something very different from what he was saying in London when the Brexit votes arose just after Christmas. And stamping down to get his way, I'm sure that's why Richard Leonard was forced to leave. I don't think he went voluntarily. I think he probably was forced to leave. And if that's his attitude, Labour in Scotland is dead.
Finally, Professor Richard Murphy, Sir Keir Starmer seems to have abandoned the position on Europe, even though he's a convinced European. Is that just because of trying to attract votes back in the red wall?
I can only presume that this is political positioning for opportune reasons. He might be trying to appease the red wall. The reality is he is alienating very large numbers of people who wonder, how could I vote for a Labour Party that won't talk about a positive relationship with Europe, that won't talk about anything but a policy in economic terms that looks like austerity, that isn't embracing the fact that we need clear constitutional reform in the UK, not just greater devolved powers or independence for those parts of the UK that want it, but also first past the post to make sure that there is the opportunity for opinion, a wide range of opinion, to be represented in Parliament. When the Labour Party is seen as an obstacle to all those things, what is its future? And what is the future of political choice in England in particular, where, frankly, the options for the person arriving in the ballot box next time round are going to be decidedly limited? I'm worried about it.
Professor Richard Murphy, thank you so much for joining us on the Alex Salmond Show.
Thank you.
If a week is a long time in politics, then a year is an eternity. And never has that been more true than through the long, slow nightmare of 2020. Boris Johnson's made a hash of the pandemic, and his European deal with fishermen struggling to maintain their markets looks at best mediocre. But he has a Commons majority of 80. Bojo has plenty of time to regain his mojo. Sir Keir Starmer's Labour Party has come back to respectability, but is that enough to get back to power? There's a real question mark over whether he has the cut-through to cope with the harsh economic times ahead. And then for both major parties, there are the restless natives of Scotland. Are we going to settle down or are we going to settle up? This coming year promises to be a very long time in politics indeed. So now from Tasmina, myself and all at the show, it's goodbye for now. Stay safe and we'll see you again next week.